Growing up in a small, secluded town has its own strange charm, and I've always felt it in the air around here. Our town, surrounded by the dense woods of New England, is a place wrapped in old secrets and whispered stories, ones that most people avoid talking about. People go missing here. Not frequently, but just enough for those rumors to persist, enough for me to feel that there's something hidden, waiting to be uncovered. One hot summer afternoon, I decided to drag my friends into the woods, feeling restless and in need of adventure. Lucas, my younger brother, came along reluctantly, and Emma, our childhood friend, was curious enough to join us. Ben, the wild card of our group, was the last to agree, rolling his eyes at the idea of ghost hunting but joining us anyway. To me, it wasn't about ghosts. It was about proving to myself that there was something tangible in those dark woods. We wandered deeper than usual, along trails most people don't follow. The forest felt different there, older, almost pressing down on us. And then we found it, a run-down cabin nestled among the trees, hidden behind thick layers of branches and leaves. The sight of it gave me chills, but it also lit a fire of curiosity in me that I couldn't ignore. "Let's check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Lucas hesitated, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. "Sarah, maybe we shouldn't. This place gives me the creeps." I shrugged. "Come on. It's just a cabin. What's the worst that could happen?" Ben smirked and pushed open the door, making a grand, sarcastic gesture to invite us in. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of mold and decay. Dust danced in the streaks of light that slipped through the cracks in the walls. But what caught my attention immediately was a dusty stack of videotapes on a table in the corner, like they were left there on purpose, waiting to be found. Emma picked up one of the tapes, frowning. "Who leaves tapes in a place like this? And why?" I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed a handful of the tapes, feeling a strange pull to take them with us. It was as if they held something important, something that might finally explain the strange stories that had haunted our town for as long as I could remember. Back home, we huddled together in my basement, our only light coming from the old television as we inserted the first tape into the VCR. The screen crackled to life, showing shaky footage of a dark room, then a face, barely visible in the dim light. It looked like an old man, gaunt, with deep-set eyes that stared straight into the camera. The footage was strange, filled with muttering and half-finished sentences. But then something caught our attention. The man in the video mentioned a familiar name, Emma's grandfather. I glanced at her, seeing her expression shift from confusion to something close to fear. That's my grandpa's name," she whispered. "But he's never mentioned anything like this." The room fell silent. We watched the tape until it ended in static, the same thought crossing all of our minds. There was more to our families, to our town, than we'd ever been told. It felt like a door had been cracked open, revealing a darkness we'd only ever sensed in fragments. As we sat there in the dim light, a mixture of fear and excitement coursed through me. I knew we had to see what else was on those tapes. It was only the beginning, and something inside me needed to know what lay hidden beneath the surface of our quiet town. Whatever secrets were waiting, I was determined to find them. The days that followed felt strange, like everything around me was out of focus. I started noticing things I hadn't before, small, unsettling details that seemed to follow me everywhere. It was as if watching those tapes had lifted a veil, and now I was seeing my town, my family, even my own home through a darker lens. The strangest things were happening to us. Emma told me that she'd started hearing voices at night, faint whispers that seemed to echo down the hallway outside her bedroom. First, she thought it was her imagination, but when the whispers grew louder, like they were right outside her door, she was too scared to even get up and check. Ben, who had always brushed off the weirdness with a laugh, now admitted he felt like he was being followed whenever he walked through the woods. He'd catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of his eye, but when he turned, there was nothing there. I was no exception. Every night I had vivid dreams, nightmares really. I saw the faces of the people in the tapes, but they weren't trapped in that dark room. They were outside, standing under the moonlight, staring up at my bedroom window. In my dreams, they would whisper things, words I couldn't understand, as if they were trying to tell me something urgent. Each time I woke up, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the feeling lingered. I was afraid that whatever was haunting the tapes had found its way into my own mind. Lucas grew more distant, barely speaking to any of us. I knew he wanted to forget everything, to walk away before we uncovered more. But every time I suggested we meet up again, he'd show up. Reluctant, silent, but there. Like he was being drawn back by something he couldn't control. I couldn't blame him for wanting to quit. I was scared too. The more we watched, the more I felt like we were stepping into a trap, a web spun long before we were even born. But something in me wouldn't let go. I needed to know what these tapes meant, who these people were, and why their stories were buried in the woods. One night, while rewatching one of the tapes alone in the basement, I noticed something new. The cameraman walked into the frame for a brief moment, his face partially obscured. It was only a glimpse, but it sent a chill through me. There was something oddly familiar about the way he moved, his posture, something that I couldn't quite place. But it felt like I knew him. I shut off the TV and just sat there, trying to piece together what was happening. Every instinct I had told me that this person wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who had ties to our town, someone who understood exactly how to hide the truth. Tapes weren't accidents or mistakes. They were warnings, reminders of what our town wanted to forget. As I lay awake that night, trying to quiet my racing mind, I started wondering if we'd find our own families on those tapes next. The thought terrified me. For the first time, I began to realize that maybe these weren't just random disappearances. Maybe it was bigger than I'd ever imagined. Maybe it was part of us, sewn into the very fabric of our lives here. The next day, we decided to meet in the woods by the cabin, the place where it all began. We couldn't speak about it at home anymore. It felt too close, too real. Standing under the trees with the wind rustling the leaves, I could see the same fear in all of us. We were tethered to this, unable to look away, each of us silently hoping that someone else would find a reason for us to stop. But no one did. Deep down, I think we all knew we were beyond turning back. Whatever we were uncovering, it was coming for us, pulling us closer with each passing day. The days that followed felt strange, like everything around me was out of focus. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Small, unsettling details that seemed to follow me everywhere. It was as if watching those tapes had lifted a veil, and now I was seeing my town, my family, even my own home through a darker lens. The strangest things were happening to us. Emma told me that she'd started hearing voices at night, faint whispers that seemed to echo down the hallway outside her bedroom. First, she thought it was her imagination, but when the whispers grew louder, like they were right outside her door, she was too scared to even get up and check. Ben, who had always brushed off the weirdness with a laugh, now admitted he felt like he was being followed whenever he walked through the woods. He'd catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of his eye, but when he turned, there was nothing there. I was no exception. Every night I had vivid dreams, nightmares really. I saw the faces of the people in the tapes, but they weren't trapped in that dark room. They were outside, standing under the moonlight, staring up at my bedroom window. In my dreams, they would whisper things, words I couldn't understand, as if they were trying to tell me something urgent. Each time I woke up, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the feeling lingered. I was afraid that whatever was haunting the tapes had found its way into my own mind. Lucas grew more distant, barely speaking to any of us. I knew he wanted to forget everything, to walk away before we uncovered more. But every time I suggested we meet up again, he'd show up. Reluctant, silent, but there. Like he was being drawn back by something he couldn't control. I couldn't blame him for wanting to quit. I was scared too. The more we watched, the more I felt like we were stepping into a trap. A web spun long before we were even born. But something in me wouldn't let go. I needed to know what these tapes meant, who these people were, and why their stories were buried in the woods. One night, while rewatching one of the tapes alone in the basement, I noticed something new. The cameraman walked into the frame for a brief moment, his face partially obscured. It was only a glimpse, but it sent a chill through me. There was something oddly familiar about the way he moved, his posture, something that I couldn't quite place. But it felt like I knew him. I shut off the TV and just sat there, trying to piece together what was happening. Every instinct I had told me that this person wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who had ties to our town, someone who understood exactly how to hide the truth. Tapes weren't accidents or mistakes. They were warnings, reminders of what our town wanted to forget. As I lay awake that night, trying to quiet my racing mind, I started wondering if we'd find our own families on those tapes next. The thought terrified me. For the first time, I began to realize that maybe these weren't just random disappearances. Maybe it was bigger than I'd ever imagined. Maybe it was part of us, sewn into the very fabric of our lives here. The next day, we decided to meet in the woods by the cabin, the place where it all began. We couldn't speak about it at home anymore. It felt too close, too real. Standing under the trees with the wind rustling the leaves, I could see the same fear in all of us. We were tethered to this, unable to look away, each of us silently hoping that someone else would find a reason for us to stop. But no one did. Deep down, I think we all knew we were beyond turning back. Whatever we were uncovering, it was coming for us, pulling us closer with each passing day. After that day in the woods, something changed in me. The tapes, the nightmares, the shadows, I couldn't ignore the feeling that everything was connected, not just to the town, but to us, to our own families. I was done with hints and whispers. I needed real answers, and I knew exactly where to start. That evening, I confronted my mom. She was washing dishes, her back to me, when I asked, "Mom, did Grandpa ever mention anything about the people who disappeared from town?" The sound of running water didn't hide her hesitation. She froze, her hands stopping mid-wash, and for a long moment she didn't answer. Finally, she sighed, turning to face me, her eyes tired, as though I'd just unlocked a door she'd kept closed for years. "Sarah," she said slowly, "there are some things about this town that are better left alone." I refused to back down. But people vanished. They're not just stories, are they? And their families, did they even know the truth? She looked away, avoiding my gaze. "Your grandpa told me once, a long time ago, that there were things we didn't need to know, things done for the good of the town." For the good of the town? I could barely keep the anger out of my voice. "Mom, how could disappearances possibly be for anyone's good?" But she just shook her head as if my words meant nothing. "We never questioned it, Sarah. We knew it was dangerous to dig too deep. You should leave it alone." Her answer left me cold. It was clear she wouldn't give me more, and maybe deep down she didn't even want to know herself. I wondered how many people in town carried the same burden, hiding behind old justifications, passing the silence down through generations. The next day, I told the others what I'd learned, or rather, what I hadn't learned. Emma's face went pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. "My grandpa, I remember him talking about certain families, always saying they were chosen. I never knew what that meant, and he wouldn't explain." "Maybe it's time he did," I replied, even as I felt a gnawing dread in my stomach. With some reluctance, Emma agreed to confront her own family. Hours later, she came back to us, her face unreadable. "It's true," she said quietly. "My grandpa, he admitted it. They did things, made some kind of pact. He wouldn't tell me all the details, just said it was something they had to do to protect everyone. He sounded almost proud of it. That single word, proud, made my skin crawl. I'd hoped he'd feel remorse, some sense of regret, but instead he saw it as a duty, a legacy that had been passed down and accepted. Ben, who'd stayed silent until now, finally spoke up. "So our families, they just sacrificed people? For what? Some kind of prosperity. And they expect us to just go along with it?" I looked around at each of them, seeing the conflict etched on their faces. Part of me wished we could all walk away, pretend we hadn't uncovered this darkness. But I knew, as they did, that we were already in too deep. Question wasn't if we should find out the rest of the truth, but whether we had the courage to face what that truth would mean for our own lives. Lucas, who had been the most reluctant of us, took a deep breath and looked me in the eyes. "So, what do we do now?" There was only one answer, and we all knew it, even if none of us dared to say it out loud. We would dig deeper, pull back the curtain fully, and expose everything, even if it meant tearing apart the very fabric of our families and our town. Determined to uncover everything, we decided it was time to confront our families together. There was no point hiding our knowledge any longer. Too many secrets were already coming to the surface. It was late afternoon when we gathered at my house, our parents surprised to see us together. Tension in the room was palpable, each of us waiting for the other to begin. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "We know about the pact," I said, keeping my voice calm. "We know it involves the people who disappeared. We know it was to protect the town." My mom's face turned white. Emma's grandfather, who had come to pick her up, stood there with a hardened expression, his eyes narrowing as he looked at us, as if sizing up a threat. "It was for everyone's safety," he said, his tone defensive. "Things had to be done to protect what we have here. Protect." Ben cut in, his voice filled with anger. "You're saying people had to disappear, people who had families, lives, just to keep this town going?" Emma's grandfather didn't flinch. He straightened his back and crossed his arms, meeting Ben's glare without a hint of remorse. "You're too young to understand," he said coldly. "Sacrifices were necessary. Sometimes, hard choices have to be made for the greater good." Emma's face twisted with disgust. "How could you say that? You knew those people, Grandpa. How could you justify something like this?" Her grandfather's gaze softened just for a moment. "It wasn't easy, Emma, but it was what had to be done. This town is our home, and our families have kept it safe for generations. I did what was necessary." We all did. The room fell into silence. I could see the weight of his words pressing down on each of us, the horror of realizing that this pact, this tradition, wasn't just a piece of history. It was alive, part of the town's fabric, woven into our very lives. Lucas spoke up, his voice shaky. "And what about the people who disappeared? Did their families know what happened to them, or did you just let them wonder?" Emma's grandfather looked away, his face hardening again. "They were taken care of, in a way. No one outside the families involved knew the full truth." Something inside me snapped. "And what about us? Did you ever plan to tell us what you did? That we were all part of this sick, twisted legacy?" My mother took a step forward, her eyes pleading. "Sarah, it was never meant to be your burden. We didn't want you to know." "But we do know," I replied, my voice trembling with anger and something close to despair. "And now, what do we do with it?" No one had an answer. The room was filled with silence, each of us wrestling with the enormity of what had been revealed. I looked around at my friends, seeing the same confusion and fear in their faces. Part of me had hoped that exposing the truth would bring us some kind of relief, a sense of justice. But instead, it felt like a weight, a dark cloud that would never leave us. Ben, who had been quiet since his outburst, spoke up again, his voice low and cold. "You think you did this for us? You think this town is worth protecting if it's built on the lives of innocent people?" The adults didn't respond. They stood there, stubborn, unyielding, as if their silence alone was enough to justify their actions. I could feel the rage boiling inside me, and yet, beneath it, a profound sadness. This was the legacy we had inherited, a town haunted by secrets, our families bound by an unspeakable pact that had cost so many lives. With a heavy heart, I turned to the others. "We can't keep this quiet. People need to know the truth, even if it means tearing everything apart." Emma nodded slowly, her eyes filled with tears. Ben clenched his fists but gave a grim nod of agreement. Lucas hesitated, glancing toward our mom, but finally met my gaze and nodded as well. We left that day knowing we couldn't change what had happened, but we could make sure it would never happen again. Whatever the cost, we would find a way to break the cycle and expose the truth that had been buried for so long. The drive back from that confrontation felt like an eternity. The sun had set, leaving the sky a murky gray, the kind of darkness that swallowed up everything. We rode in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. It was clear that we couldn't keep this secret any longer, but the reality of what we were about to do, what it would mean for our families, our town, was setting in. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my mom's words, about how they had justified everything as necessary, as if sacrifice was a price they'd willingly paid to keep life moving forward. But whose lives mattered more? Theirs or the ones they sacrificed? I sat alone in the basement, staring at the tapes stacked on the table. They felt heavier now, burdened with the truth that could destroy everything I'd ever known. I knew that if we released this, the town would never be the same. Families would be torn apart, including my own. But if we stayed silent, we'd be complicit. I couldn't live with that weight on my conscience. Around midnight, I called the others, asking them to meet up one last time. When they arrived, I told them my plan. We'd take the tapes and all the evidence we had to a local journalist, someone we could trust who wouldn't bury the story. It was the only way to make sure this didn't get swept under the rug. "Are you sure about this?" Lucas asked, his voice tinged with fear. "If we do this, there's no going back." "I'm sure," I replied, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. "This isn't just about us. It's about everyone who never got answers, everyone who was forgotten." Ben nodded in agreement, his jaw clenched. "It's the right thing to do. They've gotten away with this for too long." Emma was the last to speak, her voice cracking as she held back tears. I don't know how my family will look at me after this." "Neither do I admitted softly. "But at least we'll know we did what was right." The next morning, we gathered all the tapes, the notes, and the information we'd uncovered. I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as we loaded everything into the car. I knew I was about to shatter my mother's world, to ruin the image of the town she'd spent her life protecting. But some things needed to be broken to make way for the truth. The drive to the journalist's office was eerily quiet. The streets were empty, the town still asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to hit. When we arrived, we handed everything over without a word. The journalist looked at us with a mixture of shock and curiosity, but we didn't stick around to explain. We left quickly, not looking back. As we stepped outside, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. We'd done it. Truth was out there now, beyond our control. Whatever happened next was in the hands of fate. Over the next few days, everything came crashing down. The news spread like wildfire, stories of the town's dark history, of the pact, of the people who had disappeared without a trace. Families turned on each other, old friendships were severed, and the once close-knit community fractured under the weight of its own secrets. The town became a ghost of itself, haunted not by the victims who had disappeared, but by the truth that had finally come to light. At home, my mother couldn't even look at me. We barely spoke. I could tell she blamed me for what I'd done, for tearing apart everything she believed in. It hurt more than I expected it to. But deep down, I knew I'd made the right choice. I'd done it for those who never got a voice, who never got to tell their story. That truth was worth the cost. A few weeks had passed since we'd brought the truth to light, and in that short time, everything I'd known had unraveled. Walking through town felt different now. There was a heaviness to every step, a sense that even the buildings and trees were haunted by the knowledge that had finally surfaced. People avoided eye contact, neighbors whispered in huddles, and the streets had grown quieter, emptier. One chilly afternoon, I found myself wandering back into the woods, alone this time. I hadn't planned on returning to the cabin, but my feet led me there as if some invisible force was pulling me forward. Felt like a final pilgrimage, a chance to close the chapter on everything we'd unearthed. The cabin was exactly as we'd left it, quiet, dark, almost frozen in time. I stood in the doorway, taking in the damp, decaying smell and the dust particles swirling in the faint streams of light that seeped through cracks in the walls. Felt like a tomb, a place that had held secrets for so long that it had absorbed their energy, their weight. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the silence settle over me. But then I felt it, a presence like someone was standing just behind me, watching. I turned, expecting to see one of my friends or maybe just my own shadow cast against the wall. But there was no one there. And yet I could feel it. A strange peace washed over me, as if the spirits of those we'd uncovered were finally at rest. The whispers I'd heard in my dreams, the faces I'd seen in the tapes, the nightmares that had haunted me, they all felt distant now, like memories that were fading away. I realized that by exposing the truth, we'd not only freed ourselves but maybe freed them too, the ones who had been lost to silence. I left the cabin without looking back, making my way slowly through the trees. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor, but this time I felt no fear. The forest felt lighter somehow, as if the weight it had carried for so long had finally lifted. As I reached the edge of the woods, I stopped and glanced back one last time, a strange calm settling over me. I knew I'd never forget what we'd discovered or the price we'd paid to reveal it. But I also knew that for the first time I could walk away, free from the shadows of the past. And in that quiet moment, I felt at peace, ready to leave the dark forest and its secrets behind me for good.